The one most pervasive underlying foundational problem with North American culture and a lot of cultures around the world, just that disconnection. Disconnect is our biggest single problem.
Just 1 minute ago, Eustace Conway's family broke their long silence, revealing chilling secrets buried deep within the Blue Ridge Mountains. For years, whispers surrounded his mysterious life in the wild, but no one imagined the truth would be this haunting. What they uncovered about the forest, the symbols, and Eustace's final days will send a shiver down your spine. The wilderness was never silent. It was watching. The man who became one with the mountains. Long before television crews and tourists ever heard his name, Eustace Conway had already chosen a life that few people could even imagine. At 17, while other teenagers were learning to drive or planning college, Eustace packed his knife, a blanket, and a dream, and walked straight into the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina. He did not go there to escape the world. He went to find something he believed was lost: freedom. The mountains soon became his teacher. He built his first shelter from fallen trees, cooked over open fires, and drank from cold mountain streams. His days were filled with chopping wood, planting corn, and learning to live with the rhythm of the forest. Every sunrise and sunset shaped him into someone new. The air smelled of pine and wet soil. The nights were silent except for the sound of owls calling from the trees. It was here that Eustace felt most alive, as if the land itself was breathing beside him. Years later, he founded Turtle Island Preserve, a 1,000-acre stretch of wilderness where he taught others how to live simply and respect the earth. People came from all over the country to learn from him. They called him the modern mountain man. But for those who truly knew him, especially his family, Eustace was much more than a teacher or survivalist. He was a man searching for meaning in every leaf, every gust of wind, and every shadow that passed through the forest. His sister once said that living in the mountains changed Eustace in ways even he did not understand. He became quieter, more distant, and his letters home became shorter with time. When he did visit, his eyes had a faraway look, as though part of him had stayed behind with the trees. He talked less about people and more about what the land was trying to tell him. "The forest speaks," he told her once, "but most people are too loud to listen." To outsiders, he looked like a man perfectly at peace, but his family noticed something else. The silence around him was growing heavier. He spent nights alone by the fire, writing in old leather journals filled with strange sketches of spirals, trees, and circles. He spoke of patterns in the stars and dreams of voices calling him deeper into the woods. When Judson asked what they meant, he only smiled and said, "You will understand when you feel it." In his later years, visitors recalled how Eustace would often stand for hours in the forest without moving, as if waiting for something unseen. A student once said she found him touching the trunk of an old oak, whispering softly under his breath. When she asked what he was doing, he replied, "Listening." The more time he spent in the mountains, the more people began to wonder if he had crossed some invisible line between man and nature. He no longer seemed like someone who lived in the wilderness. He seemed like someone who belonged to it. Every scar on a tree, every bird's cry, and every shifting cloud became part of his story. Yet there was also an unease that no one could name. It began with the way animals reacted around him. Horses that once followed him calmly began to stop at the edge of certain trails. Dogs barked into the dark as if sensing something moving unseen among the trees. Eustace would simply watch, expressionless, and say, "The mountain knows." As years passed, his connection to the land deepened into something almost spiritual. His journals from that time grew stranger. Some pages were filled with phrases like, "The ridge hums at night," or "The wind carries old names." It was as if the mountains were whispering secrets meant only for him. No one truly understood what Eustace was experiencing, not even his family. They loved him, but they feared he was drifting further away from the world of men. They wondered if solitude had finally taken hold of his mind, or if something ancient within those mountains had begun to speak through him. Eustace once wrote, "You do not find the wilderness, it finds you," and perhaps it had. But what if those whispers from the woods were not just in his mind? Let's find out. The whispers in the woods. By the time Turtle Island Preserve became known to visitors, something about the place already felt different. It was not only the smell of cedar or the quiet flow of streams that drew people in. It was the feeling that the land was alive, aware of every footstep that crossed it. Those who came to learn from Eustace often spoke about an energy they could not explain. Some said the forest hummed at night, like a soft vibration in the air. Others heard faint knocking sounds that came from deep within the trees, steady and rhythmic, as if the woods had a heartbeat of its own. Eustace began keeping detailed notes about these strange occurrences. He wrote down the time of night, the direction of the sounds, and even how the animals reacted. His handwriting, once neat and organized, became rushed and uneven. He called these experiences the whispers. He told his family that the forest was communicating, not through words, but through sound and pattern. He said nature remembered everything. There was a particular oak tree near the heart of the preserve that he treated differently. It was enormous, older than the cabins, and its trunk was scarred with thick lines that twisted upward like veins. Visitors noticed Eustace often left food or small carved figures near its base. When asked why, he would smile quietly and say it was to keep the land calm. A few volunteers began to follow his habit, leaving wildflowers and pieces of fruit near the tree whenever storms approached. The people who lived near the Blue Ridge Mountains had long told stories about the spirits that watched over the land. Old Cherokee legends spoke of unseen guardians who lived in the high forests, protecting the balance between man and nature. Eustace had heard those stories from local elders and believed there was truth in them. He started referring to unseen presences as the Watchers. At night, he was often seen walking through the woods with a lantern and notebook. His staff said he would sometimes stop suddenly, close his eyes, and whisper as if listening to a voice they could not hear. Some thought he was simply meditating, but others noticed how unsettled he seemed afterward. When dawn came, he would appear at breakfast, silent and pale, and write for hours without speaking. The crew from the television show Mountain Men once arrived to film at Turtle Island. They expected Eustace's usual lessons on survival and craftsmanship, but they quickly realized there were places he would not allow them to film. He called them sacred areas. When the producer pressed him for a reason, Eustace simply said, "You should not disturb what has been watching us for centuries." The crew laughed at first, but when their cameras began malfunctioning near the oak grove, no one found it funny anymore. His family noticed that his letters home became stranger around this time. Instead of describing farm work or students, he wrote about light patterns in the trees and melodies carried on the wind. His sister Judson worried he was spending too much time alone. She urged him to visit home more often, but he refused, saying the mountain still had things to show him. Over time, his journals began to fill with sketches of symbols that looked like eyes, spirals, and lines that connected across pages. He labeled them Paths of the Watchers. Visitors found them fascinating, though a few left the preserve early, saying the forest made them uneasy. Some even reported seeing flickers of light moving between the trees after dark. Eustace grew more protective of Turtle Island. He told his students not to wander alone after sunset. He built fences around certain trails and forbade anyone from going near the back valley where the old oak stood. When asked why, he only said, "There are places even the forest keeps to itself." To most people, Eustace seemed eccentric but harmless. Yet to his family, it felt like he was slowly slipping into another world, one that existed just beyond sight. His fascination with the whispers grew into devotion. He believed the forest had chosen him to hear what others could not. Then one day, everything changed. His nephew Daniel, who often helped around the preserve, followed him into the woods and stumbled upon something hidden deep among the trees. It was something that would show how far Eustace had gone in his search for understanding. The hidden cabin and the Watchers. Daniel Conway had always admired his uncle. To him, Eustace was more than a man. He was a living part of the mountain itself. When Daniel was a child, he would visit Turtle Island every summer to learn how to chop wood, ride horses, and build shelters. But as he grew older, he noticed a change in Eustace. His laughter was rarer, his voice quieter, and his eyes seemed to drift somewhere far beyond the horizon. One autumn morning, Daniel decided to visit unannounced, hoping to surprise his uncle. What he found instead would stay with him forever. The sun had barely risen when Daniel entered the preserve. He walked the familiar trails, but something felt different that day. The forest was still, as though holding its breath. When he reached Eustace's main cabin, he found the door open, but the place empty. A pot sat cold on the stove, and a pile of wet firewood leaned against the wall. Eustace's boots were by the door, but his jacket and knife were missing. Daniel called out, expecting an answer, but only the wind replied. Worried, he followed the path behind the cabin that led into the dense part of the forest. After about an hour of walking, he noticed a faint trail covered with moss and branches, one he had never seen before. Curiosity guided him deeper until he came upon a small clearing. In the middle stood an old hidden cabin built from rough logs and nearly swallowed by vines. It looked abandoned, yet there was smoke rising faintly from the chimney. Daniel hesitated before stepping inside. The air smelled of damp paper and burnt cedar. On a wooden table sat stacks of journals, their covers cracked and darkened with age. Hundreds of them were piled neatly against the walls, each filled with Eustace's handwriting. The pages were covered in sketches of spiral symbols, eyes carved into mountains, and strange shapes that looked half human, half animal. In one corner stood a shelf lined with jars holding stones, feathers, and what looked like ash. Daniel began reading one of the journals. The entries described nights when Eustace heard footsteps around the cabin, though no one was there. He wrote about lights moving through the forest and a voice that spoke from the wind, calling him the Keeper. Some pages mentioned the Watchers, ancient beings of the mountain who guarded its hidden wisdom. The writings started calm and poetic, but as the dates went on, they grew restless. The last few pages of one book were filled with trembling lines. "They are awake now," one entry said. "The ground hums beneath me. I went too deep." Just as Daniel was closing the book, he heard movement outside. He stepped out into the clearing and saw Eustace standing near the trees, his face pale and eyes hollow. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Eustace said softly, "You should not be here." Daniel tried to ask what the journals meant, but his uncle shook his head. He looked exhausted, as if he had not slept for days. "The mountain speaks to those who listen too long," Eustace said. "I went too deep this time." With that, he turned away and walked back into the forest, leaving Daniel standing alone among the shadows. When Daniel returned home, he told the family what he had found. They were both fascinated and frightened. His mother said it sounded like the solitude had finally consumed him. But Daniel knew what he saw in Eustace's eyes. It was not madness, it was fear. In the days that followed, the family tried to contact Eustace, but he would not answer. The next time anyone saw him, his clothes were torn and his hands were scratched as if he had been digging in the earth. He refused to speak of what had happened, only muttering again and again, "I went too deep." Those words would haunt Daniel for years. None of them yet understood what Eustace meant, but soon they would. Because after that night, strange things began to happen on Turtle Island. The air grew colder, animals scattered from their usual paths, and the forest itself seemed to twist and change. Because soon, even the mountain itself seemed to turn against him. The Vanishing and the Warning. The years that followed brought an uneasy silence to Turtle Island. Eustace continued to live alone on the land, tending to his animals and teaching fewer students than before. Those who visited noticed how different he had become. His once warm and welcoming presence now carried a strange distance, as though part of him remained lost somewhere in the woods. He still spoke kindly, but his eyes seemed to search for something that no one else could see. Then one cold morning in early spring, Eustace disappeared. His close friends grew worried when he missed a scheduled class and left his tools scattered here in the yard. His horses were still tied near the fence, and the chickens had not been fed. The fire in his cabin had burned out hours earlier, leaving only ash. A search party began that same evening, made up of neighbors and local volunteers who knew every inch of the preserve. They combed the trails, calling his name through the trees, but there was no answer. His footprints stopped abruptly near the old oak tree, the one he used to call the Keeper. Beyond that, the ground was untouched, as though he had vanished into the air. The searchers found no torn clothing, no signs of struggle, not even a trail of broken branches, only silence. 3 days passed. Then, just before dawn on the 4th day, one of the volunteers saw movement near the stream. It was Eustace. He was barefoot, covered in mud, and shivering as if he had been walking for miles. His eyes were wide and unfocused. When they tried to help him, he whispered, "The forest took me." Those were the only words he would say that morning. His family rushed to see him, relieved but shaken. Eustace refused medical help and stayed inside his cabin, speaking only in fragments. "It showed me," he said once, staring into the fire. "It took me so I could see." When his nephew Daniel asked what he meant, he replied, "The mountain wanted me to understand, and before it was too late." A few days later, while cleaning the cabin, Daniel noticed deep claw marks on the inside of the wooden door. They were unlike any animal tracks he had ever seen. The marks were long, almost human-shaped, and carved into the wood from within, as if something had tried to escape. When they showed the marks to Eustace, his face turned pale. He said softly, "It was not trying to hurt me. It was trying to warn me." From that moment, Eustace changed again. He stopped speaking about the Watchers, but grew obsessed with what he called the warning. He built new fences around the parts of the forest he once visited freely. He avoided the oak tree and refused to enter certain trails after sunset. When visitors asked why, he would only say, "The mountain remembers." Rumors spread through the nearby town. Some said he had gone mad. Others believed he had seen something supernatural. But those who truly knew him said he was not afraid of madness. He was afraid of something much older, something that had finally awakened. That summer, storms began sweeping through Turtle Island more frequently. Lightning struck trees near the cabins, and strange burn marks appeared in spiral shapes on the bark. The air felt heavy and charged, as if the forest was waiting for something. Eustace started recording the storms in his journals, describing them as the mountain's breath. His handwriting grew shaky, his sentences shorter. His sister Judson visited and begged him to leave the preserve for a while. "You need rest, Eustace," she told him. "You have been alone too long." He shook his head. "I cannot leave." The warning was not for me, it was for all of us. Her words could not reach him. He stood at the window that night, watching as thunder rolled across the ridges. "The forest took me to show what lies beneath," he said quietly. Judson would never forget the look on his face when he turned toward her. His eyes seemed filled with both sorrow and awe. She asked what the forest had shown him, but he only whispered, "You would not believe it." Warn him about what? The night of the totems. The storm that struck Turtle Island in 2013 was unlike anything the Blue Ridge Mountains had seen in decades. The sky turned an unnatural shade of green, and the wind carried a strange hum that locals still remember. Trees bent until their branches touched the earth. The sound of rain hitting the tin roofs was deafening. By midnight, the entire preserve looked as if the mountain itself had decided to cleanse it. Cabins that had stood for years were torn apart. Barns, fences, and animal shelters vanished beneath mud and debris. Yet when the sun rose the next morning, something strange appeared in the middle of the chaos. A single round patch of land, no more than 20 feet wide, stood perfectly untouched. The grass inside was still dry, and not a single branch had fallen there. At the center of this strange circle were a series of tall wooden carvings. Each one had a long face with hollow eyes and swirling marks carved deep into the grain. Those who lived near Turtle Island said the totems had been carved by Eustace himself just days before the storm. He had called them peace symbols for the mountain. He had worked on them quietly, long after sunset, with only a small fire to light his tools. Some of the volunteers had watched him carve but never asked what they meant. He often said the mountain listened to those who respected it, and that sometimes it spoke back in its own way. When his family came to see the damage after the storm, they were unsettled by what they found. The totems stood tall and clean, as if the storm had bent around them. His brother Judson stared at them for a long time before whispering he believed the land was punishing and forgiving. It was hard to argue with that when they saw the untouched circle surrounded by destruction. In the days that followed, people came from nearby towns to see the spot for themselves. Reporters wanted to interview Eustace, but he refused most of them. To the few who managed to speak to him, he said something that stayed in their minds for years. When people take without asking, the mountain screams. He did not explain what he meant, but those who knew him understood that he was talking about more than the storm. That night, after the visitors had gone, Eustace sat by the totems with a lantern beside him. The air was still heavy and wet, and thunder rolled faintly in the distance. He placed his hand on the wood as if he were greeting an old friend. He stayed there until morning, barely moving, as if waiting for the mountain to answer him. Some said they saw his lantern flicker through the trees all night long. Others swore that the wind seemed to circle the mountain in slow, even breaths. Weeks later, when the fallen cabins were rebuilt, no one touched the circle. It remained just as it was, a quiet patch of green surrounded by new growth. The totems became part of Turtle Island's legend, and people began to believe that Eustace had found a way to speak with nature itself. His family, however, felt uneasy. They sensed that he had gone too far into the mystery of the land, that he had become something more connected to it than human understanding allowed. Years later, Judson said in an interview that he sometimes heard his brother's words echoing in his mind whenever the wind blew through the trees. When people take without asking, the mountain screams. He said it was no longer just a warning. It felt like a memory, a voice carried by the hills. What made the untouched circle even more unsettling was that it never changed. Through rain, snow, and time, nothing ever grew or died within it. The soil remained as it had been that morning after the storm. Visitors claimed to feel a strange calmness there, as if the air itself was watching them. And that led to the question that no one could answer. The storm had passed, the mountain had screamed, and the totems still stood. But what if the mountain was no longer crying out in anger? What if it had gone quiet for another reason? What if it was listening? The final silence. Years passed after the storm that left Turtle Island forever changed. The land had healed, the trees had grown back, and the cabins had been rebuilt. But something in Eustace Conway began to fade from the world. The man who once welcomed hundreds of visitors, students, and nature lovers to his preserve started to disappear from public life. He stopped returning calls, declined interviews, and quietly ended his television appearances. It was as if the storm had taken not just his land, but also the last piece of his connection to ordinary life. His family tried to visit him often, but each time they saw him, they said he seemed more distant. His eyes were softer, quieter, as though they were looking far beyond what was in front of him. He still lived simply, chopping wood, tending to the animals, and walking the trails, but he rarely spoke. His sister later said that he seemed to be living between two worlds, one rooted in the mountains and another that no one else could see. When he finally stopped writing letters and answering his old friends, his family went through his belongings to make sure he was all right. That was when they found the journals, dozens of them, stacked neatly in an old wooden chest. The pages were filled with notes written in his careful handwriting. Some pages recorded weather changes, rainfall, and animal behavior. Others contained strange drawings that looked like spirals, trees with eyes, and shapes of light floating above the hills. At first, his family thought they were just his private thoughts, the writings of a man who spent too long in isolation. But as they read more, they realized something unusual. The entries seemed to predict events that later came true. One journal, dated months before a local flood, described water rising near the riverbanks and washing away bridges. Another mentioned an early migration of birds that matched exactly what scientists later recorded that year. There were even notes that spoke of tremors, small earthquakes that would happen days after he wrote about feeling the heartbeat of the ground. It was as if Eustace had learned to listen to the land in a way no one else could. His sister told Blue Ridge now, in a quiet interview, he's where he always wanted to be, part of the mountain. She said it without sadness, as though she knew he had finally found what he was searching for all his life. Locals began to share their own stories. Some said they saw a faint lantern light moving along the ridge near his old camp late at night. It would flicker once, twice, and then vanish before dawn. Others claimed that the forest grew strangely silent whenever they walked too close to that ridge, as if the woods were waiting for something. There were even hikers who said they heard a man's voice whispering softly from the trees, repeating words they could not understand. No one has seen Eustace in years. The cabins at Turtle Island remain, though they stand mostly empty now. A few volunteers still care for the land, keeping it open for those who wish to see where he once lived. They say that everything feels untouched, as if time has stopped within those woods. The circle of totems still stands, weathered and gray, their hollow eyes watching the sky. Even in the hardest storms, that small patch of earth never floods, never cracks, and never grows. Some believe Eustace became part of the land, that his spirit merged with the mountain he loved so deeply. Others think he is still alive, wandering through the trees, living in complete silence among the whispers that only he could hear. Whatever the truth is, the people who knew him say he finally found peace. The same peace he had been chasing since he first walked into the forest as a young man. His story now feels like a legend, told in quiet voices around fires and mountain trails. The man who became one with nature, who listened when no one else did, who heard the world breathe. His final act was not to speak, but to disappear, leaving behind only the wind, the mountain, and the silence that now lives between them. And as his family said in their last interview, Eustace didn't vanish, he just went home. But with that final revelation comes one haunting thought that still lingers in the hearts of those who hear his story. Did Eustace find the truth he was looking for, or did the truth finally find him? What do you think really happened to Eustace Conway in those mountains? Share your thoughts in the comments. The truth might still be out there.